Hello everyone, my name is Sheep in the Card, also known as Hamish McGregor, and welcome to our third and final installment of Rovers 101. Today we're going to be going to the moon to show off some of the slightly different handling and other things about the rover, as well as how to properly land one. There are a few different methods and ways you can land a rover. Today I think I'm going to be trying for a manned landing, just so we can fix wheels and flip the rover if necessary. However, I am going to do a slightly different style of rover. The rover itself, I'm thinking of having some limited fuel capacity on it, so we can pick the rover up just on a few small engines and fly it out of a hole or that sort of thing. Anyway, without much further ado, I'm going to get started. I'm going to use the Mark 1 command pod. The reason I use this, even though the Mark 1 lander can is lighter, is that not only this is a smaller, more visually appealing capsule, but I also feel that the other one does say it's not for atmospheric entry. So doing atmospheric entries on it feels a little bit cheaty, I'll be honest. Now, we don't need much fuel to do a return to Kerbal on this thing, so just one of the ordinary cans, half cans, sorry, is going to be enough. We will need a decoupler though, because we don't particularly want to try and land with the fuel and engine still on it. With only this little, we might get away with it, but there's no point really risking it. Another thing is that even though the rover will have plenty of solar panel and power for us to use, we're going to want some panels on the lander itself, because if we don't, it's going to use power for its torque when we're flying back to Kerbal, and we don't want to get stranded without it. Trying to turning the engine on and using gimbling for torque is not a fun experience. I'm going to put those on an angle. I'm going to mount the rover directly below this capsule, and I'm going to add, the reason I move these is I'm going to add two booms with the engines for descent. The advantage of this method is that if we mount these booms on decouplers, then we're going to drop all the landing gear and that associated weight pretty quickly after liftoff. And also, it gives us a nice wide base that we can drop the rover on. There's no force on its wheels, or we're not going to break anything. We're going to land on other landing gear, and it's going to effectively drive out like it's driving out of a garage. Well, in theory. Practice proves to be a far more difficult beast. Pretty much we need the same system as we're going to use to get back to Kerbal, but two of them for landing. This is going to give us about the right thrust for landing, more the merrier, until you get to the point at which you can't land properly because you press the button and jump into the air. But the fuel is going to be a bit too much, and the reason I've chosen to go that way is because quite often when you're coming in for a landing, you see like a lunar arch or an interesting terrain feature. This gives us enough fuel that we can actually just cruise over to it and just go have a look. If we didn't have that, we would be pretty much stuck to landing where we decided we were going to land when we began our descent from orbit. Now I'm going to go for a pretty small design of rover. Actually, I'll use 2 times symmetry and 2 lots of it, because the game automatically reselects your symmetry for some reason. It's a really annoying feature actually, that you cannot put like 2 times symmetry onto a part with more than 2 times symmetry. Anyway, this is pretty much a standard small design. I'm going to use drop the body of the rover relative to the axles, just to give us a little bit more stability on the moon. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm also going to use the small rover wheels. The reason for this is, unlike on Kerbal, where the larger wheels are an advantage, the lighter spring rates here are better, because the moon only has, like, just remembering off the top of my head here, so I might be wrong, 16% of the gravity of Kerbal. So we need a lot lower rating on the spring that we're going to have, or pretty much we may as well have, a set of cinder blocks for springs. As you can see here, when you place these wheels, they place in the maximum compressed spring position. They're actually going to move down pretty much all the way to the top when we're on the moon. So even though that looks like we're not going to have any clearance, when we're on the moon, our clearance is going to be fine, because it's going to be all the way up to the top of that shaft. So this is really our minimum suspension travel clearance. Also, an advantage of using angle snap like I am here is I can see that these are both placed in a perfect line, because if this one's forward, it goes in an angle. Just makes building a bit easier. Another thing I've chosen to do is drop the height of the command seats. How much this really helps can be a bit debatable, but by dropping the height of the command seats, I'm effectively lowering the centre of mass somewhat. So, each to his own, but at the same stage, you do want a low centre of mass, and it's one way of getting it. Another set of advantages and disadvantages of doing the rover setup that I'm about to do here is that it has no probe bodies, which means it has no torque. This means you can't use the torque to help, like, flip you back if you rolled over, which can be a serious issue at times. But one advantage of not having this torque is it makes the driving mechanics a little bit simpler. If you've got the torque, then not only do you have the forces being applied to the vehicle by the turning, etc., but you also have a set of force that's being applied when you press each key by the reaction wheels. Another final factor, it's really a very minor one, is the power use. There is a tiny little bit of constant power draw from a probe. This doesn't. As long as we've got a Kerbal on it, it's good to drive. And finally, there's weight. It might sound a bit silly, but because the game doesn't simulate weight for these little octagonal struts yet, the complete weight of this rover is only going to be half a ton, just over. So adding a probe core adds another 40 to 60 kilos, which is 10%. Yeah, it works out as a reasonable difference, really. It's the big decoupler, we only need the little guy. You don't need nearly as much rocket to lift yourself to the moon as probably most people get into their heads. One of the reasons for this is that some of your default rockets, like your Kerbal X, which doesn't quite have the delta V to do a moon return, uses the largest and heaviest command pod, teamed up with a configuration of engines and etc., which isn't very weight efficient. It only needs a single radial parachute, yet it uses an extra large one. It uses the Poodle liquid engine, which has a lower thrust to mass than a lot of your other engines. Actually, I'm gonna stick on 2 adapters. There's a few reasons why I don't recommend sticking too many adapters into your craft, but this will keep it from colliding with any of our wheels and tyres, etc. And really keep it looking good is the only other thing. Now, I'm going to attach those later because I'm going to do a systems test where I'm just going to launch this and try and drive the rover around. And the first thing I noticed before I even start the test is, hey, we don't actually have a ladder on this. On the moon this would be less of a drama, because pretty much you can jump. Here on Kerbal, good luck. Anyway, so this will be, I guess we'll call it Mun Rover Attempt 1. I probably misspelt that because I didn't really look. Yeah. A few things that are going to be worth noting on our way to the moon with this configuration is we have far more rotational mass to rotate the vehicle one direction than the other. This, it's not end of the world, but it's certainly worth thinking about, because it means if we come in slightly sideways, one direction, we adjust pretty quickly. If we come in slightly sideways with one of these pods down or up, we actually take much longer to adjust. And so we can think we're fine, because we think we've got heaps of time to react, and because it's a slightly different angle, we can be stuck. It's a pretty unlikely occurrence, but it can happen. Also, I think I probably should have had those legs like way further down. Anyway, the decoupler just there. Oh well, we can still test the rover. Bill, time to get into action. You've got some rover wheels to repair. So far so good, I guess. The people at Mission Control are probably going, what the hell just happened? But Bob, it's your time to shine. You have the rover. First thing I'm going to do is check the weight. 600 kilos basically, 590 with Kerbal on board. Mind you, Kerbals are like 90 kilos, so I wasn't far out with my estimate of a half ton. Also, even on Kerbal, you can see how much that suspension's given us an extra ground clearance. Okay, we just ran the RTG into something to keep in mind, but I don't know how worried I am on the moon, because whilst the terrain actually is quite variable in its height and so on, the transitions tend to be a lot smoother than the Kerbal made parts around the Space Center. It's also worth noting, because our Kerbal's 90 kilos, it sits right on one side. I can turn far more aggressively in one direction than another. But this doesn't seem to handle too badly. I can get it pretty much up on 2 wheels and pull it back. So for our purposes, this is probably fine. Whilst that was quite a bit of a drop from the main spacecraft to the ground, again on the moon I'm less worried, because the meters per second of acceleration is far lower. As I said, it's 16%. So as far as the rover goes, that's fine. One thing it didn't have, that I sort of mentioned I was wanting to do at the start of the episode, is some fuel tanks and thrusters. I sort of got halfway through building and I thought better of it, for the simple reason that we're going to add pretty considerably to its total mass. I mean, there's 78 kilos even in an Oscar B tank, and 30 for the liquid engine. So it's like 200 kilos more to have fuel and thrusters on this rover, and it doesn't have any torque or anything still, so even that wouldn't give us much in the way of, you know, the ability to actually fly the thing, even though the thrust would be there. Right, another disadvantage of doing it this way is we are joining technically through the rover. Now, I'm not too worried because in this design we are literally going just straight through the decoupler, which makes it the centre of the rover. There's no struts or anything. But, oh, not struts, there's no, you know, these cubic girder segments, or no fuel tanks or other little components that are going to get damaged by that. But at the same time, I guess it is something you should keep in mind, because we are necking right down to neck back up again in size, so we're going to flex around that point. I can mitigate this somewhat, and I'm going to, by adding some struts that go straight to those outriggers. Why aren't you joining? For some reason, I don't know if it's the ladder, but this is a bit unhappy. Was it symmetry causing? Yes, it was symmetry causing problems. Now, when this is the transition phase to get us out to the moon. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to use one of these medium fuel tanks and stick a single poodle engine on it. As I mentioned, these have a pretty poor thrust to mass, so that's something to be aware of, but the advantages in this setup is that if we just throw it's a single engine in the middle, so we're not got any thrust balance problems, and it remains as a 2.5 meter connection all the way through, right to this tank where we're going to neck down. Which means that if we brace off this tank to the outriggers, then suddenly we have a relatively stable setup. I mean, it's not going to be super strong, but it shouldn't wobble all over the place. I'm also going to brace back like that. These will remain there for landing. It is some extra weight, but it'll greatly increase the impact tolerance for landing on those legs. As for the rest of the rocket build, it doesn't really need to be too much. I mean, probably to lift this thing, we could get away with using a whole lot. In fact, we could get away with a whole lot less fuel than that. What am I up to? Yeah. There we go. There's probably enough fuel, and we want some decent engines on this thing because it is going to be what's going to take us the distance. So I'm going to use a pair of aerospikes. Now the pair of aerospikes is a good combination in that they're the highest thrust to weight engine that still maintains the high 390 ISP. Pretty much anything else with a higher thrust to mass ratio, your ISP begins to tail away. And whilst thrust to mass is good, we're not really wanting to carry extra fuel with us, so we need the high ISP. I'm not sure actually quite where the efficiency points are going to be, regarding like for a rocket with this much mass you should use this thrust mass engine and this much fuel to keep your speed maximized, but generally this setup is good enough, I've found. So that will transition us to the moon, and now I just need a fuel tank to fly us up most of the way out of Kerbal's atmosphere. And I'm going to do that with our friend, probably just the skipper on something like this, and some radial stages. I'm going to use radial stages rather than asparagus staging, just to keep the time for the build down. Because I'm going to drop most of these before the gravity turn, their atmospheric efficiency really does matter. So probably aerospikes again. Spam aerospikes when in doubt. They're high efficiency and high thrust to mass. I have also chosen to place the decouplers right at the bottom. This might seem strange, but by placing the decouplers down near the bottom, they're actually closer to the centre of mass when empty, because this engine is going to be most of the mass of the radial stages. And finally, no, I'm not going to stick nose cones on these. If I was playing with Ferrum Aerospace installed, I would highly recommend adding nose cones. It would make the thing far, far less drag, which particularly in the dense atmosphere at the lower point of your launch is really going to matter. But without Ferrum Aerospace installed, there's not actually an advantage in adding the mass to your spacecraft, so I'm not going to do that for the aesthetics. This isn't a particularly pretty rocket anyway. But with that, we've just got staging to go, and this thing should be ready to go to the moon. I just hope it has enough thrust to mass when we transition to that. Just the mainsail, not mainsail, skipper. So setting up staging really quickly, basically you just drag all the engines down one stage until you get something that looks iffy. We want to drop the rover before the tanks, and we only want to what? No, really what? Well, okay, that was a problem. Somehow we've managed to get two decouplers glitched inside each other during the construction process. So that's dropping the rover, that's dropping these fuel tanks, and that's dropping the rest of it so we can activate the parachute. That's the staging done. This is Mun Rover attempt 1. Ready for liftoff. I'll see you guys at the launch pad.